This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Sports and Society podcast. Your hosts are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Hey, Jay.
Hello, Jeff. Good to be with you and our guests this morning.
Yeah, in this episode, we're discussing sports in Asian communities, and more specifically, Asian sporting masculinities with two of the world's leading authorities on this topic. This episode is directly related to Chapter 7 on gender and Chapter 8 on race and sports. So we're really honored to welcome Stan Thangaraj and Constacio Arnaldo to the show. Stan Thangaraj is a socio-cultural anthropologist and the James E. Hayden Chair for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Social Justice at Stonehill College. His first book, Daisy Hoop Dreams, examines the practices of basketball, masculinity, race, class, and sexuality through co-ethnic South Asian American basketball leagues across the U.S. and Canada. His newest forthcoming book, project with University of Texas Press, looks at Kurdish American and their practices of placemaking, desire, and pleasure across sites in the United States. Constacio Arnaldo Jr. is Associate Professor of Asian and Asian American Studies in the Department of Interdisciplinary Gender and Ethnic Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He is the author of Filipino American Sporting Cultures, The Racial Politics of Play. Welcome to the politics. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Let's jump in with the first two questions. And we ask these questions of all of our guests. So, Stan, why don't you go ahead and go first? And please describe your experience in sports.
Yeah, so I grew up as a child of multiple generation of Christian preachers in southern India who all had asthma. So no one expected me to play sport, but my mom was so strong and so athletic, and she was playing all these sports as a young college student and then as a mother on the college campus that we worked at in Madurai, India. So I grew up fascinated by sport because of my mom. It wasn't the story of the dad socializing the kid into sport. I saw my mom, right? She was amazing. And all the kids in the college were playing sports. And the Christian college we were on, once a year, they split the campus into 4 teams and they would put random people on the teams. And it was all based on, Christian apostles. So here's a team based on Matthew versus Mark versus John and so on, right? And so we would battle against each other. And I loved it. I was so intrigued by it as a young kid. But then my dad got recruited to do his PhD in Harvard. And we came to Boston in 1981 with the Celtics run. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish. Oh, I love those guys. And Robert Parrish was my hero. And I was so enamored with basketball that when we went back to India, I couldn't find a space for basketball, but Indian cricket had really blown up. So I started playing cricket, and that followed me all throughout my 5 years back in India. And then once we came to Atlanta, I could connect with basketball again, with Dominique Wilkins, Spud Webb, Doc Rivers, right? Moses Malone, all these guys that were just incredible. So my journey was woven already through a certain Christian aesthetic I didn't even know about till I started reading Constancio's book on muscular Christianity and Linda Espana-Maram's book. And so sport was a part of my life in a way in which it connected me to my mom It connected me to other people in Atlanta as a recent immigrant. There were pathways to playing pickup basketball with African Americans and white students at my high school that would not have been possible if I didn't enter the realm of sport. Sport was a site to build community and to build family for someone who felt so out of place.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stan. That's incredible. Constacio, do you want to address this question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I really loved how Stan kind of broke it down and talked about his entry into sports. I am a child of immigrant parents from the Philippines. I grew up in the Bay Area of California, and while folks might think the Bay Area is diverse, it's really progressive, I actually grew up in a place called Clayton, California, which is like east of Oakland, east of Concord. If anybody knows where Walnut Creek is, east of Walnut Creek, literally at the base of a mountain called Mount Diablo. And so my parents moved to the Bay Area. My late father was in the U.S. Navy. My mom is now a retired nurse. And so I think for me, my entry into sports was through my late father. And I still remember this quite vividly. When I was a kid, I would stare at his trophies that would like be placed on this mantle in our house. And they were bowling trophies. And I found out that he was an avid bowler and he would bowl on the Navy ship with his friends. And so I would stare at them like wanting to have trophies of my own. And so my late father introduced my two other brothers and I into sports. So he introduced us to like football, especially, and baseball. So I started playing baseball at a young age. I was a fan of the Golden State Warriors, the San Francisco 49ers, the Oakland A's, and the San Francisco Giants. So I played all kinds of sports, baseball, basketball, volleyball, football, soccer. And so when my father passed away, my mom actually took up the task of driving my brothers and I to football practice, baseball practice, basketball tournaments. And she, in fact, was the reason why we continued to play sports. And so it was a huge part of my identity as an athlete, but also as a fan. My favorite athletes were Black athletes, Tim Hardaway performing the crossover. And in my book, Filipino American Sporting Cultures, his crossover and the way that I practiced it allowed me to think more, I guess, theoretically and analytically about what can the crossover do if we apply it as an analogy, but also as a metaphor. So I credit Tim Hardaway for introducing me to the crossover and allowing me to practice it. So that was like my move in basketball. I'm not very tall, but I found a lot of pleasure in faking people out, crossing people over, and just loving sports from a really young age.
Well, Constacio, you're anticipating our next question, and which is, how has your experience in sports influenced the questions you ask and the research that you conduct? And I think that the crossover, right, since that is important in your research, right, that's a great segue to this next question, if you'd like to address that.
I love this question because, one of the things I appreciate as a scholar of sports is allowing me to reflect on like how has sports informed my research and the theoretical claims I'm making. And so for me, reflecting on all the sports I played, sports was in many ways like a training manual for me to understand questions of race and in particular heterosexual masculinity. And so it gave me a template or a masculinity manual of sorts to early understandings of what it meant to be a man, to be a manly boy. And so I say this because thinking about the teams that I was on or the folks I was playing with or against, mainly men or mainly boys and then later young men, like it was okay to be angry or to posture aggression, but it was not okay to be sad or to cry. Right, like the line in A League of Their Own, there's no crying in baseball, right? And so because sports is about the body, I was supposed to act tough and to use my body as a weapon. And so this meant that performing a certain kind of masculinity meant denigrating girls, women, or queer folks. But then to complicate this a little bit more, my own brown body became a way to challenge what it meant to be an American, right? Because Asian Americans are seen as forever foreigners. And so thinking about the crossover as a theoretical or analytical tool, like how can we use the experiences of Asian American or Asian athletes to challenge these long-standing stereotypes, to fake out or to challenge these dominant representations of Asian Americans. And I guess finally, I want to emphasize that sports for me was a way to bond with other boys, right, or young men. It was a certain kind of intimacy that we developed that I also wanted to highlight, because it's pleasurable to play sports, and I don't want to kind of shy away from that either.
Yeah, and one of the things you see in a Constanzio's incredible book is it covers a wide spectrum of sport, right? And the ways in which we never think about Asian American masculinity and Asian masculinities across the spectrum of sport, right? Where we might understand it in, well, no, this is what Filipinos are supposed to play or what South Asians are supposed to play. And there's a way in which we're put into very constrictive, restrictive categories that don't showcase how diverse our sporting experiences are. And that's where his book, going from the realm of spectatorship with boxing to flag football with women to basketball, right? And I think it allows us to see the much larger scale of engagement with sport that's also both across time is transhistorical and across nations is transnational. Like, we bring these stories and experiences of sport that's not readily there when we talk about Asian American masculinity as either too nerdy, too terroristic, right? Or too unmanly, not man enough, right? And so what his book does is capture the great spectrum of Asian American sporting experiences.
Oh, yeah. I mean, those are fantastic points. And Constancio, I don't know if I mentioned to you, but I had a friend in college who used to like to tell me Filipinos are pound for pound the best basketball players in the world. And I just thought it was so hilarious that he would use that boxing metaphor as the equalizer, right? Because the weight categories become the equalizer in boxing. And we'll come back to Filipino boxers in a moment. But that claim to using sport to make that claim to manhood, despite the fact that he's perceived as small and foreign and had a very athletic persona, so that he couldn't be seen as nerdy. But Stan, I want to pick up on something you brought up when answering this question, is the way in which Asians and Asian men get put into boxes related to sport. And I know you push back a lot on the cricket playing South Asian image. And so maybe you could talk about your relationship with sport and how that and talk more about how that informs the research that you do.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I love that question. And so in my book, Desi Hoop Dreams, when I was doing the research for it in Atlanta and in Chicago, there were cricket leagues featuring South Asians, a very vibrant scene in Atlanta. But I wanted to think more about, why is it that when we understand Asian Americans, we understand it through the trope of model minority? What does model minority do as a gendered phenomenon? We always think of it as a racialized phenomenon, but we don't see how racializations are also gendered. So I was thinking about like model minority as a way to think about how there's a celebration of a certain type of professional and academic success and excellence, but the ways in which it confines us in a way, as Vijay Prashad talks about, as all brain. And what that does is allows us to understand South Asian and Asian American masculinity only through a certain type of professional practice, very stoic, who's an academically excellent and professionally proficient, but without pleasure, right? And so what I do in Desi Hoop Dreams is try to understand masculinity as a site of understanding desires and pleasures. It's not just about gender roles, but the ways in which we talk about masculinity as an affirmation, embodiment, and performance of pleasure. What it means to be a baller, and the way in which Constancio and I like to self-identify each other as scholar ballers, right? And for us, in my book, that meant that you're looking at young men who, first of all, are not model minority, right? Who come post 1980, who are working in kiosks at malls. Their parents are working in gas stations. Their children do not go to college, or if they do, it's often to community college, right? And they don't have the same type of access to prestigious four-year colleges and to the professional realms of medicine, lawyership, and science, right? And engineering. And so what I wanted to do was to look at how, as masculinity and respectable masculinity is understood through the model minority, it doesn't allow us to see the struggles within this community, to see how they make themselves visible. Their stories are not visible as other than as nerds, as script spelling bee champions, right? Which they won for like 14 of the last 16 years, right? But there's a whole spectrum of everyday American sporting pleasure and everyday American sporting masculinity that's not detailed even in the script spelling bee, when several of the winners talk about playing basketball, playing football, and playing baseball, right? All of a sudden, those stories go missing. So what I wanted to do in Desi Hoop Dreams is to look at how the site of pleasure allows us to see Asian American and South Asian American engagement in American sport as not just a spectrum of trying to claim Americanness and finding belonging, but a way to affirm what it meant to be a South Asian American man.
Yeah, I'd like to just pick up on what you both have said. And how has popular culture, for example, in the United States in particular, influenced what you're talking about now? Kind of this transition from being stereotyped in one way, but seeking pleasure in another, through sports, for example, because some of the stereotypes and the perceptions that have been popular in the United States is that Asian American men generally are not seen in physical terms, in terms of physical abilities, but there's been a change in popular culture, TV, movies, and so on. And I'm wondering how that has affected what you're talking about now. Has it perpetuated, to what extent has it perpetuated stereotypes, and to what extent has it challenged them in ways that you've noticed in your own lives?
Constancio, can I jump on this? Would that be okay? Thank you. So one, we're still seen as exceptional, right? That is not normal. That a great Asian American athlete becomes the abnormal Asian American figure, right? And even the media coverage of like Jeremy Lin during the incredible Linsanity run was never attentive to the everyday sporting cultures in which he grew up in. There was not a mention of the Asian American sporting cultures in California. No mention of the longer history of Japanese American basketball leagues in California that Nicole Wims and Christina V. Chin look at, right? And so when you're postured as exceptional, then it is a complete erasure of the everyday quotidian practices of sporting masculinity that we live through every day, from childhood through adulthood and in adulthood. Like, for example, when I play pickup basketball, which I still continue to do, unless people know me, I'm not going to get picked up. Even if I am the tallest person on the court, even if I am the most physically, corporally resembling a tall, lean, basketball muscular player, I do not get picked up because our bodies are already scripted prior to our arrival. So what that means is we have to constantly prove that we belong in this space where it's not just that we have access to it because we're men, but as men, there's a hierarchy of who is seen as the legitimate basketball player and respected as that we have to put so much work to being seen as even a plausible athlete, right? And so, Jay, like your question really gets at the ways in which our everyday stories of sporting excellence become invisible, right? That Jeremy Lin becomes the only visible marker that then removes all the incredible athletic feats of Asian American athletes, especially Asian American women in American sports. And this is where we're seen as both physically not man enough to play American sports of basketball, football, and baseball. And then secondly, we're seen as culturally not American enough to know it to play, right? Like the stereotype of South Asian Americans and Middle Eastern Americans as terrorists is actually a construction of a dangerous masculinity that is outside the contours of American cultural acceptability, that we're not culturally American enough, right? So the realm of the physical and the cultural play out in producing us as always outside the boundaries of Americanness and American sporting masculinity.
Yeah, Constancio, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, in terms of your experience, to what extent did those stereotypes influence your approach to sport, and how characteristic is that among other Filipino athletes and Asian American men generally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I love that Stan emphasizes this notion of the everyday, the mundane, the quotidian, because I think, the case of Jeremy Lin, like he becomes the exception, but like there have been Asian American basketball leagues that have been around forever. Like I had counted, and I actually did like a mini research project looking at, okay, how many Filipino/Filipino American basketball leagues are there in the United States? And I counted over 150, but that was like a couple of years ago. And so Filipino Americans have been playing sports ever since the U.S. colonized the Philippines. It became part of the institutionalization of the Philippines, like the Young Men's Christian Association became embedded in the Philippines during U.S. colonialism. So the comment that Jeff made earlier about like Filipinos are the pound for pound best basketball players in the world, we can look to how and why based on the U.S. colonial process in the Philippines. The Philippine Basketball Association is the second oldest professional basketball league in the world, right? And so I think about Kathleen Yep's book that talks about Chinese American communities playing basketball in the early 20th century. There have been basketball leagues, sporting tournaments in California in the early 20th century. And so to assume that Asian Americans have been just introduced to sport is simply false. And it's important to recognize this long history that's connected to colonialism, to immigration, to settlement in the United States, that allows us to see that Asian Americans have always been part of this popular cultural practice, that they're not the exception, that rather they have been part of this notion of claiming a certain kind of Americanness for centuries.
Constancio, there isn't a lot of talk in the U.S. about colonization of the Philippines. Can you just very quickly explain that and why you say the U.S. colonized the Philippines? And then, and maybe, if possible, use that to transition into a little bit more discussion about the different Asian leagues that exist right now.
Mm-hmm. Right. So when the U.S. colonized the Philippines in 1898, Part of the process involved institutionalizing sport. And the idea was that sport would enable Filipinos, colonized Filipinos, to quote unquote assimilate as good colonial subjects. So I'm citing Linda Spania-Merrim's important book, Creating Masculinity, where she talks about the colonial process in the Philippines. So American soldiers introduced Filipinos to boxing. The YMCA introduced Filipinos to volleyball, baseball, and basketball. And the idea was that if Filipinos can learn these civilizational imperatives of sport, then they can eventually be, they can engage in self-rule. So the idea was that sport can transform the so-called inferior Filipino body into good colonial subjects and then eventually not need the U.S. colonists to, they didn't need U.S. colonialism anymore if they actually assimilate into what it meant to be colonial subjects and gain independence.
If I could just jump in really quickly right here, this is not unique to the Philippines, and people might not realize this, but Rudyard Kipling, the poet of the British Empire, very famously wrote the poem "The White Man's Burden." It was about the U.S. conquest of the Philippines. Right? We don't often recognize that, but my father had the exact same experience with sport in an American Indian boarding school. And the idea that Indian boys, their bodies and their sense of self was their masculinity was a failed masculinity because it wasn't the same as an Anglo-American. And so then football, especially boxing in many of the schools, was used to masculinize these Indian boys so they could become U.S. Citizens. But yeah, go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, and I love Constanzio's point, and this is why his work is so important. So, Constancio, could you also describe as, when Jeff and Jay brought up this point, what it also means at this point of U.S. colonialism after the Spanish-American War, that Filipinos are being considered by the U.S. nation state as little brown friend, and what that does to think about sport?
Yeah, thanks for that follow-up question, Stan. So Filipinos were imagined as these little brown brothers, right? That they were seen in a really paternalistic way in which our little brown brothers, our little brown friend, need our paternalistic colonial advice or colonial, I'm stumbling across my words, but they needed, it was a paternalistic way in which Filipinos were imagined and seen. And so if we think about the little brown brother as a racializing term or a racialized term, we can see how Filipinos were never seen on equal footing with the Americans. That in fact, Uncle Sam, right, would see Filipinos as diminutive, small, right, little, and that sports would be a way in which they could even grow 3 inches through the YMCA. So it was a really problematic, racist way in which American colonists viewed Filipinos, Filipino bodies, as little, as brown, and in need of colonial uplift. But sports would be that vehicle through which they can actually become independent.
Oh, so I actually want to go back to the question of the various different Asian sports leagues today. You've both done research in those spaces. Can you sort of talk about how sport is used across different Asian communities? Because again, what we really want to emphasize that there is tremendous difference across Asian communities, because in the U.S. we have this construct of Asian that really makes no sense. I mean, what is the relationship between a person living and from Siberia and a person living in Syria, right? It's absurd. So, but still, there are these leagues, and we have this idea of Asian and Asian leagues. So Yeah, break that down a little bit for us.
So growing up as a kid in India, we always imagined ourselves as Asian. Then coming to Atlanta, I was told I was not Asian, that East Asianers were Asian, right? And so what you see is that the Asian American community actually absorbs U.S. centric geographies of race and nationhood and identity categories that don't always align with how people back in Asia might imagine them, right? And so when I came here, I was told I was white, and I never thought of myself as white, right? And I said I'm Asian. They're like, no, you're not East Asian. I was like, okay, I don't understand this, right? And so the political movement by people from Syria, as you mentioned, from Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Palestine, places in the Middle East or the Swana region, they've now started to label themselves as West Asian, right? And for us in India, as South Asian, to mean Pakistan, Bangladesh, Tibet, Nepal, Sri Lanka, India, right? And what then happens is when you see these sporting leagues form in the U.S., they're often stuck within these U.S. racial categories, where Asian America is confined based on a U.S. imperial understanding of space, right? And so within that, you see how there are Japanese American leagues, South Asian American leagues. Even within my research, there are Sunni Muslim leagues versus Mishmaili Shia leagues, right? So there are even these breakdowns in religious leagues that really tear apart and deconstruct the idea of Asian America or Muslim as a singular thing, right? So what I've seen is the ways in which some of the folks who came as refugees. So when I looked at the Asian Ballers League, which has its base in Atlanta, but has tournaments for people across the U.S., being founded by a Cambodian American coming on a refugee passage, they were much more open because of their working class background and living with many communities of color to have Asian America be a much broader category than some of the Korean leagues that I got to know, or the South Asian League, with the ways in which it really profiled people who were Afro-South Asian American versus white South Asian American, the policing of those. So you see like the differences in the migration stories of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders tell us what the possibilities of Asian America and Pacific Islander America can be as a broad category for coalition and broad world building versus ones that get caught up in the same racial logic that the U.S. demarcates as Asia.
Maybe, Constanza, you could talk a bit about Filipina flag football players and some of that research that you've done.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. So in one of the chapters of my book, chapter 3, I believe, I write about predominantly Filipino American flag football players with a couple of Asian American flag football players. And so I would practice and play with Filipino American flag football players in tournaments in college. And these tournaments were primarily Asian American and or Filipino American flag football tournaments. But in the chapter, and so I would practice and play with them, and I saw how incredibly athletic they were and how tough they were and committed to playing flag football. But there was one tournament in particular that they would always talk about. So when I was doing these interviews, they would always talk about this one flag football tournament that they would play and they would be invited to until they were excluded. But we could talk about that later. So they would bring up the fact that they would play in this flag football tournament against these white women's sororities. And initially, white women did not think that they were actually that good. So they would make these comments about Filipino American flag football players like not being athletic enough, They probably only know martial artistry. They're not very good. And so the trope of them being the forever foreigners, they didn't take them seriously. So like, they're not very good. We're not going to take them seriously. But in fact, first tournament, these women whooped on them. They beat the white women flag football teams the first year. The second year, the same thing. Third year, the same thing. So it got to a point where the competitiveness was heightened, the physicality was heightened. Filipino Americans were balling, and they were scoring touchdowns. They were juking their white counterparts. They were intercepting their passes. And so eventually the white women got fed up, and they stopped inviting the Filipino American flag football players to the annual tournament. So much so that at the end, every year the team names get engraved on this trophy. And the trophy serves as a reminder of who the champions were. So 4 years in a row, Filipino Americans would win, but they never got their team name engraved onto this trophy. And so that was a point of contention that some of the players talked about, was that here, you didn't take us seriously in the first place, and then we get excluded. And so during this process, I think it's important to point out that there are stereotypes about Asian American women, right? That they're fragile, they're hyper feminine, they're hypersexualized. But in this flag football tournament, Filipino Americans and the Asian Americans were challenging these stereotypes. They weren't being hyper feminine. They weren't performing a certain kind of hyper femininity. They weren't the Lotus Blossoms. They were performing a certain kind of female masculinity. They were challenging the ways in which Asian American bodies could move, could function in a flag football space. And so they were incredibly athletic and brilliant in the way they profiled the game, studied the game, and eventually they dominated this annual flag football tournament.
That's incredible. And again, it connects to a lot of other experiences in sport that racialized peoples have when they engage in sports. And so the sporting contest is racialized, but to me, even more so, connecting to your earlier points, they become like a mini colonial struggle that plays out on the sporting pitch. And could maybe you could address that a little bit, either Stan or Constacio.
I mean, yeah, I think I talk about it as a crucible of competition, right? So part of what is also important is that it's not the black-white racial and gender paradigm. It is now an Asian American white contest. Latinas were, I think they appeared in one tournament, but that was it. Black women never appeared in the tournament. And so I'm not sure why, but I think part of the reason why Filipino Americans were invited is because of race and gender. It's that, oh, okay, well, like, I think we'll invite them because we don't think that they're very good. And I mean, big mistake there, because they were actually really dominant. And so, yeah, I think part of it is them engaging in a certain kind of racial and gendered battleground on the football field, a flag football field, that broadens our understandings of race beyond the black, white, and male racial paradigm, and forces us to think about how these played out in a seemingly pleasurable site in flag football, but that these pleasures become highly politicized.
Yeah, thank you for discussing this, because you're providing a narrative and a perspective here that doesn't often get represented in discussions of race and ethnicity and sport and gender. So this is something that's very important for students to understand, and especially in terms of their own relationships. If you're a white student and you see this happening in connection with the experiences of particular Asian American men or women, you can intervene and serve as an ally. And I think that's kind of an eye-opening option for white students and black students. As you mentioned. So that can provide a foundation for cohesion that doesn't exist in most circumstances.
Yeah, and what Constancio also brings up with this incredible chapter on women's flag football, which is also an amazing article found in the Journal of Asian American Studies, is what is it about our anxiety about the exclusion of Asian American men from sporting cultures? There's so much anxiety about the experiences of Asian American men and the particular racialization of them that emasculates them, that we go silent on our examination of Asian American women. So his chapter is so vital to thinking about what is it that also allows us, by looking at these moments like the basketball leagues or flag football, to think about how are national sports gendered. That basketball, football, and baseball become gendered as respectable, heterosexual, masculine. That for men who feel emasculated and who feel marginalized, like Asian American Pacific Islander men, that it is through these sports that we regain our masculinity at the expense of excluding Asian American women. That women who participate in these spaces are still sexually stigmatized and sexually slurred as butch, that negates the possibility of Asian American femininity and athletic ability to come together. That they're always imagined outside the realm of respectability when women, Asian American women, play the mainstream American sports, right? And so what this tells us is that individual sports where we see a huge presence of Asian American women, like tennis and golf, and then with gymnastics with Suni Lee as a great example, we don't see that same type of entryway into mainstream American sport, right? And that's because it's not just that our communities don't want to do that. It's because national sports are incredibly policed and the gatekeeping is so firm that women, no matter what race or ethnic background, have a much harder time entering the realm of national sports. Like women might be able to play cricket in the US much easier than they would be able to play cricket in India, because cricket is the national sport and seen as very masculine in India and for men. And this is where, like Constance's work, the work of women performing sporting masculinity is completely dismissed and worse, refused as even a possibility.
So in the way that you're both talking about marginality, and even marginality within the category of Asian, particularly in a North American context where we think of East Asian, Korean, Japanese, Chinese as definitional of Asian. But, Constancio is Filipino, Stan, you're South Asian. But you're also talking about your research. And so I want to connect this to your research and how you approach your research. So as a South Asian and a Filipino scholar within Asian studies, right, you're marginalized within a marginalized category. How does that help your scholarship and the questions that you ask in your research?
I mean, I hope people don't get mad at me for saying this, but in Asian American studies, studying sports is still not seen as a worthy topic of study. And I remember reading the research and trying to see, okay, who in Asian American studies has written about sports? I can name them on my hand. Linda Spaniamiram, Christina Chin, Kathleen Yep, Stan Thangaraj, right? I don't know, Stan, I'm missing anybody. Nicole Wilms writes about Japanese American basketball leagues. So even in the field of Asian American studies, sports is not necessarily taken up as a serious scholarly topic. But to answer your question about how it's helped my scholarship, I don't know that, I mean, it's great to be like one of the only well-known scholars of sports and Asian American studies, but it's also disappointing. I think it's important to look at sports not just as like some whimsical activity, but in a critical and productive way that also can kind of talk about these long histories of colonialism that challenge these stereotypes. And it takes into account the diversity of the Asian American experience, right? Sports, for many Americans, is something that's a part of our everyday lives, even if we don't take it as, we don't really write about it as a serious scholarly topic in Asian American studies. Like, Asian Americans are somehow in some way engaged in sports, right? Whether it be in their schooling system or as casual fans. So I'll just leave it there. I probably have to like think about that a little bit more, but I want to kind of let Stan take it over from here and see what else he has to add. Yeah.
Just a quick note, I can never take it from there because Constancio is so fast on the basketball court, I'm never catching up, right? I just hope that he misses something so I can get a rebound and get a stat line check right there, one rebound. But for how I understand this question, I think it's really, really important because what Constancio and I have endured is marginalization within critical sports studies, where the talk of race refuses Asian America. We are not a realm of study, critical realm of study, and only recently have a couple of books been, awarded for their work. But within Asian American studies, sport is not a form of engagement, like critically, embraced form of engagement. Like, there's so much work on art and literature and drama and film, but a refusal to engage with popular culture, right? And so what that means is Constancio and I are operating in realms where there's always silence. So that silence has been really important for me in thinking about my own research project. So how it helped me with my research project is that it gave me a methodology to look for the silences and the absences of who is not there when I'm doing research. If they're not there, it means there are larger structural forces of power based on gender, sexuality, or class that prevent certain South Asians from being there. Like certain gay men who are not there, certain women who are not there, how working class South Asian communities are depicted as problematic within these spaces, right? So I wanted to always look at the silences and to see what the silences mean rather than looking at who's always there. Because at times that becomes the majority voice, the dominant voice. So what I've tried to do, and what Constancio's book does brilliantly, is to center messiness and not look at Filipinx America as a monolith, and I don't look at South Asian America as a monolith, because we differ based on caste, religion, ethnicity, national origin, class, sexuality, right? And so what we wanted to do in our work is to, while we center pleasure, look at those pleasures as a site for the contradictions that make South Asia not a knowable thing. And so what I do in my book, which Jeff knows, and we've talked about this, is I make sure South Asian America is not something you can actually put your hands on, right? Because it's that diverse, but rather these are categories that are politically informed, but our academic research must not fall into these political categories, but rather deconstruct them.
Yeah, and that's a very important point for our listeners, especially those listeners who come from a sport management program, because if you end up working in areas where there are diverse Asian populations, you can break that silence and create forms of community that don't exist at present. And I don't think that perspective is often represented. So, this is an important one for not just people in the sociology of sport coming from a sociology background, but also people in sports studies and in sport management in particular.
So we're going to be running a little bit short on time pretty soon. And Stan, why don't you go ahead? And then I've got a question that I've been so patient to ask this one question, and I think you guys know what it is. But go ahead, Stan.
Well, actually, it's not that important. I was just going to say sport management needs to engage much more with deep theory and complex methodologies to not make sure that communities are fit into management metrics. If they're fit into management metrics, then we fall prey to the same type of essentializing logic that does not allow us to see the heterogeneity within our communities.
And I will say we do have an episode scheduled specifically about sport management and the relationship of sport management and sociology. Because one of the limitations that sport management has struggled with, and a lot of the younger scholars are very much struggling with, which we'll talk about in the episode, is the history in the U.S. of sport management taking management to mean business management. And and that's what you're getting at. There's so much more to how sport is run and managed in the U.S. or any other place than making money from it. But that's another episode, but it's a fantastic point. So one of the reasons I wanted to organize this episode is to talk about Manny Pacquiao. For those listeners who are not boxing fans, it's important to know that Manny Pacquiao, he was a champion in, I think, 8 different weight classes. And there, as we say in boxing, there are weight classes for a reason. It's unheard of. I think nobody has ever done that, to start at 112 pounds and then go all the way up to, I think his last belt was at 154 pounds. So that's amazing. But he is coming out of retirement. He hasn't fought for 4 years, and he's going to have a fight coming up with Mario Barrios, who's who's a welterweight champion, I should say. I mean, and he's 46 years old, and he's going to come out of retirement to fight. But so, Constancio, you've done research on the meaning of Manny Pacquiao in Filipino American communities. So can you talk about that and maybe even address, like, I don't know if you've been following people's responses to this current comeback, and I don't know if that'll change how he's understood, but if you could just talk a bit about Manny.
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question about Pacquiao. I guess I'm known as the Pacquiao guy, scholar, expert, but he is a really important figure for Filipino Americans. So in my chapter 1, I actually open up with me attending a Bible study that was organized by his team in Mandalay Bay's Michael Jackson Theater. So anybody's interested in thinking about or wanting to learn more about the Bible study, read the chapter. But my research has shown that he's symbolically a really important figure. He becomes a national icon. He's become the national icon of the Philippines and the diaspora community. His wins were representative of reversing these long-standing narratives of Philippine national loss. In some ways, he serves as an antidote to colonial gendered subjugation. So Asian men and Asian masculinity has been seen and represented as emasculated, racially castrated, to borrow a term from David Eng, right? So he's serves as a foil to emasculation, Asian emasculation. But he serves as and represents a certain kind of Christianized, heterosexual, acceptable masculinity. Right? He converted from being Catholic to Christian, evangelical Christianity, and the Bible study kind of elaborates on that. And so for Filipino Americans, they claim him as this imaginary figure of a strong, heterosexual Philippine nation. And it's not just Filipino American men. Filipino Americans have also claimed him as this national, strong, patriarchal figure of the Philippines. So I was actually, I haven't spoken to anybody that I've interviewed before, especially when he came out of retirement. So I was just trying to get an understanding of how people are searching him on the internet. So I actually looked up Google Trends, and so if you go to Google Trends and you type in Pacquiao, it'll give data about how much he's been searched for. And so a value of 100 is the peak popularity for him. So from what was it, June, more recently June 8th to now, he's been at 100. So June 5th he was at 57. June 8th, he was at 100. June 14th, he was at 100. So it tells you that, or it tells us that he's still popular. But I did find folks in the diaspora kind of saying, well, it's not really doing much for me. As you said, Jeff, he's an aging superstar. He's 46 years old. The physical body can only endure so much. So in some ways, his physical body is kind of reflective of an aging and maybe less popular superstar body. But people still value him and still claim him as the symbol of the Philippines. What I think is important is that, yes, he becomes a figure of strength and toughness and aggression, as reversing narratives of national loss. But he made some really incredible homophobic comments in 2012 and 2016. And so we also need to take into account this contradiction. And Stan writes beautifully about contradictions in the formation and production and performance of South Asian American masculinity. In that same spirit, we have to take into account the fact that Pacquiao, while he symbolizes a heterosexual masculinity, it's what he said about queer folks, about LGBTQI folks, that turned off a lot of folks in the diaspora. And so in my book, I interview a couple of queer Filipinx Americans, and they talk about how he's not my hero, right? We can find other heroes in our community. He's using religion as a cudgel against people like me. And so I'm not interested in a celebratory narrative of Pacquiao, right? There are folks that love him and adore him and kind of see him as a hero. I'm interested in how we can think differently about someone like Pacquiao, who has a much more expansive way of belonging, expresses a much more expansive way of claiming folks in the diaspora that's not homophobic.
So I want to squeeze one last question in here, because it's a follow-up to what you were just describing, Constancio, which is, in the U.S., we tend to understand race as some kind of morality tale. There's oppressors and there's victims. There's good guys and there's bad guys. I've had students in classes, I say, let's all tell our racial stories. And the racially minoritized students talk about being victims of racism. The white students talk about being witnesses to the victimization of somebody else. Nobody talks about their own moral ambiguity. And I think part of this is there's a problem with talking about race in moral terms to start with. And neither of you in your scholarship has shied away from looking at ambiguity, looking at contradiction. And so could you talk about that a little bit right now, the way that you address these contradictions and how, and in particular, how racialized men can be oppressive within their own community?
I mean, I think about R.W. Connell's work on masculinities, and that men of color can be simultaneously oppressive but subordinated. And so I think part of it is like looking at masculinity and racialized masculinity in tension. That, yeah, race becomes a morality tale. And I'm thinking about this current political moment and like, how do we think about masculinity or even like oppression that is shared, where we can find moments of solidarity despite differences across humanity? And as I guess as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist, I have to honor what people tell me when I interview them, when they talk about someone like Pacquiao, that I'm also not trying to be the morality police, and I'm not trying to tell people what to say or how to think, but to honor what they say and analyze it from a place of genuine love and care, to not just be like exposing people to their ideas, but I don't know, trying to be thoughtful about how we make sense of these processes that are tied to colonialism. Right? We can't understand race without talking about white supremacy and the oppressive ways in which white supremacy operates in our lives. How do we free ourselves from white supremacist thinking, from homophobia, from racism? I think part of it is looking at our shared experiences as oppressed people. That when we think about social justice, in sports, understanding what the research tells us and then trying to find a way to move forward in ways that is not exclusive to our own ethnic and or racial group.
Yeah, I mean, I love Constanzio's points. And one of the things that I think I tried to do in my work, and which Constanzio's book does brilliantly, is to really look at how power is never clean or absolute, right? That there are all these fissures and crevices through which you enter these spaces, but we never fully account for how structures of power travel, and that our practices of resistance do not operate fully outside of power. Like if we're working as a practice of resistance and a practice of pleasure through the very system of power, then it can never operate outside of it, right? And this is where, for any student or junior scholar, Audre Lorde's conception of the mythical norm is really, really important, where she says in America that mythical norm is that you're white, fit, heterosexual, affluent, male, Christian, right? And so we often think that for us to challenge it, we challenge it on one realm. So for the South Asian American men in my book, they might say, oh, we're challenging it on the realm that we're seen as not manly enough. But by playing into that practice of masculinity, they're not understanding the racial contours, how this then becomes a way to racialize Black and Latino men as out of bounds of sporting respectability, to deem queer men as not man enough, or to deem women as not suitable for a manly sport, right? Or not having the class respectability to play American sport, right? And so what I think is really, really crucial for us to do is we have to attend to power in its fullest realm, that is not just top down or down up, but that it saturates through all this space, that we play in a context of power. And we have to address the specificity of that context for us to see how we, in the moment of resisting power, are embracing it to create our own sets of exclusions and our own sets of hierarchy. So for us in this current moment, it's so important that we look to the realm of not trying to work through power and to claim power, but to dismantle power. And this is where practices of love and practices of caring are vital in our current political climate. And that's where, for Constancio and myself, we have known each other now for almost 2 decades. And those 2 decades are built through like sharing and being vulnerable with each other, sharing our work with each other. And we look to each other as ways to better our work. Our friendship and our brotherhood is one built of love, not one built of power. It's not built of the sense that I finished my PhD first. Let me tell Constancio what to do. That this is the only way to approach Asian American sporting cultures. And that's where I've been lucky in that process to then have a pathway to meet someone like Jeff, who has been a dear brother to me, whose work on American national identity, masculinity, and sport education has been foundational, but it's been through a realm where he hasn't been a gatekeeper as a key figure in the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport. He's been one, like Constancio, who's committed to opening up horizons, that we all work together and open up a space of loving, constructive work to make our scholarship in service of justice.
Well, that is a fantastic wrap up for our episode today. Honestly, we should do this again. This was so much fun. You guys are so fantastic and so insightful, and you illuminate so many different ideas, and we've just like scratched the surface of your scholarship. There is so much depth to the work that you do.
But it's a great spot to kind of wind things up, because to leave people with these messages is really part of what we're trying to do with the podcast.
And just a quick note, I cannot tell the audience enough how incredible, innovative, and mind-blowing of a book Filipino American Sporting Cultures with NYU Press by Dr. Constancio R. Arnaldo Jr. is. Like, if you get a chance to get Constancio's book, either as a resource for your research project or as a book to teach in class, I've had the honor of doing both. This is a mind-blowing book, a horizon-bending book. This is a book in service of radical transformation.
You know, I might take you up on that, Stan and Constancio, because I assigned Daisy Hoop Dreams in one of my classes, a couple of my classes in the past, and Stan joined in person. He joined remotely, and then after that, other students that didn't take the class heard about it, and they organized a reading group just to read his book. So I'd love to, have you do your book also, Constancio, and if you're available, we'll have you join the class.
Yeah, thank you, Stan, for those kind words. I don't really know what to say. I'm humbled by being invited, but just sharing our ideas together. And to just echo Stan's point, I'm inspired by this notion of ethical manhoods or ethical masculinity by Celine Pareña Shimizu, and I try to practice that with friends and colleagues and peers. And so one of my hopes is that, the podcast, this conversation will allow folks to think differently about masculinity that's not oppressive, that's subordinating, that's actually ethical and expansive and loving. Because if we don't, then we're not going to be in good shape. So I'm thankful and honored to be a part of this podcast.
And if you're listening to this podcast and you want to join in the conversation, jump on the Discord server. We have a Sports and Society Discord server. The invite link to that server will be in the description of this episode. And what do you think about all of these conversations? All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. And I appreciate you so much for coming on the podcast.